right, everybody, welcome to Constitution Day. Thank you very much. Hope you're doing well. I appreciate y'all sticking around and not heading to the Dallas metro area like half of our student body to go see the game. I appreciate you taking time out of your Friday schedule and what is a beautiful Friday afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the guy that sends all the emails to the poli-sci listserv. If you're a political science major or political science minor, I'm no Shrek, I'm the chair of the department. I'll introduce Dr. Ghadbian here in a second, but first I want to let you all know what Constitution Day is. Does anybody know where Constitution Day comes from? Why we're doing it? It's been maybe 12, 15 years ago. Senator Byrd from West Virginia, in a budget bill, inserted a rider mandating that any school that receives federal funding, K through 12 or university, has to commemorate Constitution Day on September 17th, the day that the Constitution was signed. Unless it falls on a Saturday, which it did this year, and so that's why we're doing it today. So every public university, more than likely, every private university, your K through 12 schools probably had some form of Constitution Day. We've been doing it here at the U of A since then. We usually have a political science faculty talking about something related to their area of expertise as it relates to the U.S. Constitution, or in Dr. Ghadbian's case, as much of his research and focus and his expertise extends to the Middle East and other countries. He's going to talk about those other places. So by way of introduction, Dr. Najib Ghadbian is an associate professor of political science and Middle East studies here at the U of A, where he teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on Middle East politics. He's the author of the books Democratization and Islamicists' Challenge in the Arab World, and the Second Assad Regime, Bashar of Lost Opportunities. He co-founded the Syrian opposition group, the Syrian National Coalition, and in between 2013 and 2018, he served as the special representative from that group to our federal government and to the United Nations. There's a pretty good chance you've seen him on TV because he's provided considerable commentary on such media outlets as CNN and Al Jazeera, and his written commentaries have appeared in the New York Times, the USA Today, AlJazeera.net, and other places. His talk today is titled Safeguarding Constitutionalism Worldwide, the Autocratic Challenges. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Ghadbian.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone, for coming on a Friday afternoon. We got you some cookies and a PowerPoint, so that's something in addition to what you're going to really learn. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about three challenges facing constitutionalism. And constitutionalism, I'm using that word instead of constitutions. I'll differentiate between these two terms in just a moment. But as we talk about challenges facing constitutionalism, I will refer to the US case, because the US is being under one of those challenges, the populist challenge. And so my talk really is going to talk about different countries, but I'm the most knowledgeable in my expertise in the Middle East. So there I could answer almost any question. When I talk about other areas of the world, less knowledgeable, so take that into account. The first point, defining constitutions, constitutionalism, and Constitution Day, of course, Bill already talked about this and what it means. And I think it's something that we really celebrate the most important aspect of the Constitution, those freedom and rights which were added to the Constitution in the first amendment and the other amendment, which made the Constitution more inclusive. I mean, if you think about signing the Constitution by these 39, if you read any, like website, I would be described as brave men. Some people would say white, rich men. So that excluded a lot of groups back then. But the amendment to the Constitution made sure that the Constitution became more inclusive and became, empowered people with more rights. I think this is important. So the term Constitution refers to the basic legal framework of governance anywhere. It's basically the what we call the basis for any political regime. It defines the different branches of government. And most constitutions intend to promote the common good and to protect human dignity and rights. And that aspect that I want to highlight today, that there is today a lot of pressures from political groups, political leaders, to infringe on that aspect, the human dignity and rights. And this is worldwide. This is like a global way. Constitutionalism refers to the ideological and institutional arrangements that promote the limitation on means of exercising state power. What I'm trying to say here is simply that those who are in position of power, and this is like a human tendency, they have the tendency to, kind of abuse their power, try to stay in power forever. And this is again worldwide. This is everywhere. So again, I'm talking about the challenges to constitutionalism worldwide, including again in democratic countries and of course in the US. We can speak of liberal constitutionalism and non-liberal constitutionalism because almost all countries of the world have constitutions. And I'm saying almost all because actually there are some countries without constitutions. Can you mention one? It's one of the major democratic countries, yes?
Like you said, a democratic country?
Yeah.
Probably France, I guess.
No, France, they had too many constitutions. They had so many of them. One of the countries that was in the news lately, a lot. Great Britain, thank you. So, Great Britain, which is considered one of the oldest democracies, actually doesn't have a written constitution. They have the equivalent of a constitution, in terms of the legal documents, acts of parliament, traditions, and if you saw the the basically memorial services for the Queen, you see how meticulous the Brits are about all of those traditions. So sometimes, having a written document which specifying the form of government, specifying the rights and all of that doesn't mean it guarantees automatically a democratic form of government. And I'm going to talk about how authoritarian countries use constitutions. Again, this is the picture of the 39 signing the Constitution. I'm going to actually skip over some of that point, but one of the main things about the US Constitution, and I speak about that from a comparative perspective, it was considered as a success story because from the second attempt after the Articles of Confederation, the framers of the Constitution came up with a document that's still lively and relevant after more than 100 years. Of course, it took all of the 27 amendments to make it more, fair, and to make it more inclusive. But I think that was, again, if you compare it, you mentioned France. France had a revolution in 1789, and they established a democratic republic for a moment. But since then, they had how many regimes? 5 republics, 3 monarchies, 2 empires, and 1 fascist government. And they didn't get their document right till 1958, when they had the last constitution, which is called the Fifth Republic Constitution. So if you compare the US, it was a success story. Of course, again, it took a lot of amendments, as I said, but I think the framers had to face, and this is very basic, my colleagues who teach American government are much more knowledgeable, so they could answer questions about that. They had to face the several challenges. One of them, they want to create, after the Articles of Confederation, an effective government, a powerful federal government, but not a dictatorial power, because the whole American Revolution was about rebelling against the power of the British monarchy. Secondly, there was the challenge between establishing that federal effective government and the sovereignty of the other state. Establishing a balance between large state and small state, which again, the US, the framers created really something innovative, the bicameral legislature. But at the essence of that process of constitutional design and drafting was the idea of compromise, which is so needed when countries engage in writing new constitutions. And I'm going to elaborate on that point. Of course, it wasn't until the passage of the Bill of Rights and the other amendment that this constitution became, as I said, more inclusive and fair to increase the suffrage of so many groups which were excluded at the time of the signing. The main point today, I'm going to talk about the authoritarian, despotic, autocratic, whatever name you want to use, challenges to constitutions and to constitutionalism. One example from the Arab world, there's this book by Nathan Brown, a colleague of mine. He wrote a book, he actually entitled it Constitutions Without, in a non-constitutional world, which is, I think, is really interesting. And after looking at the experience of all Arab countries who came up with constitutions after they became independent, around the period of World War II and on, he said a lot of these countries decided to write constitutions for the following reasons. Number one, to highlight the question of express their national sovereignty. These are really, independent countries, so they want to say, we are truly independent. We have the right to exercise power over our territory without any external intervention. Many of the ruling elites in the Arab world, whether monarchical or republicans, added a lot of, if you read in some of the Arab constitutions, what they call political principles, economic principles, and social principles. It's really, they try to highlight certain ideological orientation to these elites. So some of the republics, for instance, they followed a path of what's so-called Arab socialism, which is a mild form of communism. But they, try to emulate the experience of the one-party rule of the Soviet Union and some of the Eastern Bloc countries, not the pluralistic Western model. The third point, they needed constitutions to definitely augment and organize state authority. And so, they all have legislature, executive branch, judicial, and so on and so forth. The autocratic challenge can be seen in several ways in some of these countries. One of the dictators tend to suspend constitutions. And this is actually a common case when they do that in the name of the so-called exceptional times. There's something called state of emergency or emergency laws, which actually under international law is acceptable that most countries, including democratic countries, have that provision that under sometimes conditions of war, conditions of even sometimes catastrophe, climate event, etc., you could have state of emergency. But that state sometimes can be so abused. So for instance, the country I was born in, Syria, they had a state of emergency from 1962 till 2012. So that's a long time, And again, they used that because they said they were in a state of war with Israel. So, which means, like in this case, what they do, they try to infringe on the basic rights and freedoms of citizens. So that's a classic case of, this. I would mention something actually, that's most countries, most political elites tend to use, and that is when they are faced with serious challenges related to security, they can, again, invoke that. Do you remember what happened after 9/11 in this country? Congress passed something called
The Patriot Act.
the Patriot Act. Remember what it was about?
The Patriot Act basically said that they could spy on citizens' phone calls, video chats, and other things that would be technologically traceable.
Yes. And, here again, these are infringement on the basic freedoms and rights mentioned in the First Amendment, in the Bill of Rights. So, and you could imagine, it's one terrorist attack that led the US to do that. And there was, a lot of work about it that many members of Congress, kind of approved it without even reading the long, long provisions of that issue. It's a very controversial. Of course, there are some points which most of us would support, which is, of course, try to, follow terrorists, their financing, and so on and so forth. But definitely, it was not unpopular because it targeted mostly groups who happened to be brown, of Middle Eastern background, and happened to be Muslim. So, for the majority of us, of you, didn't really affect you, didn't have to be stopped at airport randomly every time you travel, and so on and so forth. But anyway, the point about this again, all political leaders have that tendency. There's always, we say in political science, there are tensions sometimes between political values, freedom versus security. There's a trade-off. But again, in dictatorial and authoritarian countries, they really carry this argument so far, and they abuse it to the most they can. There is always the partial implementation of constitutions. Syria had a constitution in 1973, and most of the non-democratic constitutions, they tend to empower the executive branch, especially the office of the president. So according to the 1973 constitution of Syria, the president is the head of the state, he appoints the prime minister, he has legislative and judicial powers, he's the commander-in-chief, he's the leader of the ruling party, he's the leader of the coalition of parties, he's everything. So here you're creating a constitutional dictator. And so those aspects of the constitution are highlighted. But things related to the independence of the judiciaries are not really highlighted. I mean, it's not important. Usually, they try to weaken both the judicial and legislative branches at the, to empower the executive branch. So that partial implementation is always there. And finally, there is the prejudiced interpretation of the constitutions. Again, they have the power, especially dictators who control the judiciaries. One of the weaknesses of non-democratic countries is the judiciary has really no independence and no power. I think this is, you find it, you look at every authoritarian countries, you tend to find that. Because it's the judicial branch in a democratic country that has the power to interpret the constitution. And again, even in that case, there can be a problem, as we see with the Supreme Court nowadays. Recent tricks of authoritarian leaders in the Middle East, one of them, leaders sometimes can write constitutions that would, tailor to fit them, just to really make that leader, always stay in power. I'll give an example. The second one, we've seen tendencies of many countries which follow the example of the US in setting term limits. I think the idea of term limits was really brilliant to, allow basically new leaders to be recruited, to allow new ideas to rule, and so on and so forth. So many of the countries that introduced new constitutions, once their president served 2 terms, they had to come up with tricks to get around that so they can stay in power longer than 2 consecutive terms. These are a couple of examples. I mentioned case of Syria, presidential system in 1972 constitution with a lot of powers to the president, made the last party the leading party of the state and society. This clause is taken from communist constitution, which made the communist party as the leading party of state and society, which means there is no political pluralism. So there's only one party state. And of course, in the case of the Soviet Union, one of the first things that Gorbachev did when he wanted to reform the system was to amend this article of his constitution. So this continued to be the case till 2012 in Syria. A third point, there are some basic rights, but the country again continued to be under state of emergency. All of it. So those rights, again, they're nice sometimes, there are even some economic rights that you don't find in Western constitutions, but they don't mean anything because they're not really implemented. It was amended on June 10, 2000. This is like, I think the Syrian parliament set a record in amending a constitution. 18 minutes. 18 minutes. What happened was, the Syrian media announced that the so-called Parliament of Syria, it's actually named People's Council, was convening. And they said, oh, by the way, the president died. So they decided to amend the constitution related to the age of the president, bring it down from 40 to 34, which was the convenient age of his son, to make his son the president. 18 minutes. I mean, one of the things about constitutions, they need to be flexible to be amended. We've seen that with the US Constitution. But do you know what it takes to amend the US Constitution? And this is why we have not so many amendments. What does it take to amend the US Constitution?
2/3 votes.
Then?
In the Senate, in the House, and states.
Exactly. And that's not easy to come up with. So these guys, 250 members of the People's Council, they were asked to come and attend. And of course, this shows how the parliament has really no real power. They didn't have time to debate. They said, we are introducing this amendment. And everybody was in favor. Like, one person said, why are we doing this? It's like, hey, They kept him quiet, and they unanimously, 250 voted for it. Of course, it was known it happened in a process of succession from father to son. Russia, I think, is an example of a creative dictator trying to really play with the articles of the Constitution. The Constitution of 1993 was an important one because it was truly a pluralistic kind of trying to establish a democratic system after so many years of communist rule from 1917. It had a couple of amendments. The first one was 2008. In order to extend the presidential and state Duma terms from 4 to 6 years. Why did they do that? Well, Putin became the president, first prime minister, president, then he ran and became the president in 2000. So according to the Constitution of 1993, he could serve for 2 terms. So he did that, but he didn't want to play with the Constitution at that point. So what he did, he brought one of his assistants by the name of Medvedev and made him the president, and he took the office of the prime minister. But he continued to be really the strong man of Russia. And then after 4 years, with this amendment, he can run again. So basically, he can run till 2024. In 2014, they amended the Constitution again to strengthen his control over the Federation Council, thus again weakening the legislative branch of government. And in 2020, they introduced so many amendments, 41 amendments, the most important one, that he can run for office for life, basically. So again, this is a trick that all dictators kind of try to do. Turkey is an interesting country because it's a democratic country, and since 2003 was doing really well in so many ways, but the populist leader Erdogan, how am I doing with time? 10 more minutes? I have
23 minutes have elapsed.
Okay. Okay, wonderful. I'll finish before. So it allowed for questions. The experience of Turkey, Turkey was a parliamentary system, and Erdogan was the prime minister for 3 terms, and then he decided to take the office of the presidency. He served for 1 term, and before that he decided that he wanted to extend his term, so he changed the whole system from parliamentary to presidential system. And with the support of his party, was able to pass that amendment with 51% of the vote. So that meant that he can run for 2 more terms. Again, that's a trick. Egypt. Egypt is ruled by a military dictator who actually overthrew a democratically elected president in 2013. He said first he would not run, but he said he didn't mean the not part of the statement. So anyway, he ran in 2014 and won a first term, and then second term, and then as the second term was coming to expire, they decided to make some amendment to the Constitution in 2019. The amendment would would extend the term of the president, which would mean now I have the chance to run 2 more terms on the new term, which is like 6 more years, which is 12 more years. Secondly, some of the changes allowed him to appoint the vice president and to strengthen the powers of the president over the judiciary. Remember, this is consistent in all non-democratic countries, weakening the legislative and the judicial branches of government. So the executive branch, the president, always is the most powerful in all aspects. There were 2 other amendments actually related to the military, where he came from. The military set itself as the kind of custodian of the Constitution, democracy, maintain the basic pillars of the state, civil nature, and uphold the gains of the people and the rights and freedom of individuals. When you have a military rule, this is again really contradictory. I mean, this is like they are the one who are abusing people's rights. So now they're saying we are protecting and guarding your rights. Finally, they have the right to appoint the defense minister, which is again goes against the principle that the military in a democratic country should be under civilian rule, which the previous constitution should. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about populism and maybe give 1 or 2 examples and promise you on them soon. Populism is a kind of a new trend, political approach that strives to appeal to the average person, and it's usually again the other side of it. They say that the average person's concerns have been really disregarded by political elites. So this is a basic definition. I mean, in one book mentioned here, The Global Rise of Populism, some of the features of populism. The first, again, the populist leaders try to always perpetuate the state of crisis. They're always negative in their narrative and their rhetoric, so they're anti-politics, anti-intellectualism, anti-establishment, anti-elite, etc. And that's, I think, what makes them dangerous. And lastly, populist leaders tend to dislike complicated democratic systems. You know, I mean, the way we make laws in Congress, it takes forever. I mean, this is really annoying and long and not effective. So they prefer direct democracy. And I think this is, again, a tendency you find worldwide. They like something like, you know, referendums instead of going through lengthy democratic procedures. A picture of some of collection of populist leaders. And what you can see here, they come from all over, okay? Democratic and non-democratic countries. These are two from the Middle East. So the populist challenge I'm highlighting here is two aspects of them which are dangerous to constitutionalism and which is questioning specific institutions. In the case of, you know, the US, the Brazil elections and the electoral process. Infringing on the right of minorities. We find this trend in India, China, the rise of the new rights in Europe, all over. Of course, these, again, are pertaining to the rights and freedom section in the constitutions, which, again, the constitution is supposed to protect. Some facts about, you know, populism and democracy in the US. According to the Economic Intelligence Unit, one of the ways that kind of rate countries' democratic qualities, in 2017, they said actually the US is becoming a flawed democracy. Freedom House said that the US was one of the fastest downward trajectories when it comes to democratic quality, alongside Romania and Croatia. This is the quality of the US democracy lately. Research papers clarifying over 1,000 political parties. They found that the Republican parties looks far closer to authoritarian populist parties like the Hungarian Civic Alliance, a kind of a really neo-fascist kind of rightist parties, more so than the mainstream conservative parties, like, you know, the Christian Democratic Union in Germany or the conservatives in Canada. Only 35% of Republicans trust the election system, and nearly 3/4 believe that the current president is illegal in the White House. These are scary figures. So, as you see, populism actually is something trying to undermine democracy from within. And I think that's the danger. That's, you know, why it's so global. I think we find something in Brazil. They have an election in a couple of days. The president of Brazil, who's actually nicknamed the Trump of Brazil, decided, I will not accept the outcome of the election if I don't win. As simple as that. I mean, again, this is another example. From instigation to this. These are right parties' rise in Europe. Again, just what I want to highlight is the rise of all of these parties in at least, and since this was published last week in Sweden, a very kind of liberal country, you know, considered usually ruled by the center-left coalition, a right-wing party won, and for the first time, a right-wing party with the center-right would assume the coalition governing in Sweden. And I think there's an upcoming election in Italy which showing similar trends. Again, all of these parties are part of this populist trend. The third point, and my final point about drafting a new constitution, which is a task facing so many countries which are going through transition. At some point when democracy was on the rise, and there was so many excitement, for instance, during the Arab Spring, most of the countries were looking for ways to draft new constitutions. And the summary of this experience, I'm not gonna go into so much detail because I don't have a lot for discussions, is that there are some successful examples. Some of the successful examples, South Africa, Tunisia, 2014. I could talk more about each one of them and what made them successful. Maybe I'll talk about Tunisia. The Egyptian case, they had two constitutions, 2012, 2014. They were not successful, and I'll tell you why. And Syria, 2012. And the Tunisian setback in 2022, which is again something really tragic and affecting this country, the only surviving Arab democracy. So the element again of the Tunisian case, why it was so successful, I think a lot of people who don't maybe are not engaged in this process, and I was part of a group that we tried to think about drafting a new constitution for a future democratic Syria, and we had so many experts from around the world. And the one thing I learned, even though I'm a political scientist and I teach about comparative politics and transition and all of that, the drafting a new constitution is, the most important aspect of it is the process itself, not the content. Anyone can write in, nice content, nice document, but it's the process that makes it legitimate. And this process has to be inclusive, there has to be transparency, there has to be national ownership, there has to be participation, and of course, a lot of discussions and involvement of all groups in the country. That's what makes a constitutional document, kind of legitimate. So actually in Tunisia, they've done most of that work. They had a constituent assembly, which was elected. They had several parties. They formed different committees, and one specific committees to address differences. In that case, so power sharing was an element, the spirit of consensus building and compromise. The majority offered many concessions to assure minorities, and here we are talking about political and majorities and political minorities, not ethnic or religious. If you have that situation, it's even more complicated. Finally, civil society played a major role in making that document. This is a picture of the three leaders of parliament, the president in the middle, prime minister to the right, speaker of the parliament to the left. They all belong to different parties, celebrating, really writing one of the most democratic and progressive constitutions that you've ever seen. It's amazing, and the process was right. So what happened in Tunisia, and I'm gonna skip this and go to the setback. The setback happened that after almost 10 years of democratic rule in Tunisia, the economic conditions have not improved. And this is the environment where populists thrive when you have a social and economic crisis. Aggravated by COVID, so the newly elected president decided the country was dysfunctional, the parliament was slow, the same features we talk about populist leaders. So he decided to dismiss the prime minister, suspended parliament, and assumed legislative and judicial power. Then he introduced a new constitution drafted by a small committee of actually individuals. Some of them are constitutional professors, constitutional law professors, some of his friends. And he himself is a constitutional law expert, and he claims to know all of that. But he has this populist tendency that he did not follow the right process. So finally, he passed the referendum on the new constitution. Only 29% showed up, turned out, and of those, about 89% said yes. So he was able to pass it. But this is one of the individuals, actually Mr. Hernandez, is the Attorney General in Venezuela who's working for the pro-democracy government. And he wrote an article about Tunisia. He called it the constitutional authoritarian populism. That's the term I was looking, into when I was, trying to do this lecture. So you have here authoritarianism and populism coming together. And in the case again of Tunisia, it was the populist element that allowed the president to abuse the exercise of state emergency, the decimation of the separation of power, unlawful constitutional reform, and finally using populist rhetoric to undermine the other institutions. This is a picture of, to the left, a constitutional law professor handing over a new constitution to the president. Again, they wrote it over a week period. No discussion, no participation, really lacked all of the elements. And after that, the president decided to even change some things to, empower the president further. So the guy to the left 2 days later said, I have nothing to do with this constitution. Even you didn't listen to me. So anyway, by the way, yesterday, I think the African Court for Human Rights or something, they proclaimed that all of the acts of this president are illegal. And so this is something positive on the Tunisian front. Combating constitutional authoritarian populism, this is my last one. Again, some ideas: expose and challenge the actions of populist leaders, focus on protecting human dignities and rights. That aspect, I think, is where all of us are concerned. Offer an alternative vision to populist narratives, and strengthen regional and international alliance to protect constitutionalism. I would suggest that we should make Constitution Day global day, like a world day, or maybe call it Day of Constitutionalism. And here are further readings. The last one, the 5 strategies for supporting U.S. democracy, just came out a couple of days ago with Carnegie, and thank you.
Questions? I'd like to ask Dr. Ghadbian. Right?
Yes, sir. So I'm particularly interested in Syria. The government of Syria under Assad and the other half of the phrase with the Syrian Democratic Forces, do you ever believe that they will unite under a singular constitution again?
Big question. I think we need a whole lecture to address this question, but briefly, Syria right now is divided into 4 Syrias. One is under the regime's control, backed by Iran and Russia. The northwest is an area controlled by different groups of the opposition. Some of them moderate, some others are not, and kind of protected, some of that by Turkey. The eastern part of the country is under Kurdish control, protected by the US. And there are some areas that, kind of really going back and forth between these areas. So I think one of the first things to think about finding a political solution for Syria is to basically emphasize, which a lot of countries do, the territorial integrity of the country, that all of these outside powers should basically get out, and help the different parties create a political solution. There is a framework for political solution that's introduced by the UN, and it's based on Resolution 2254, which actually gives a vision of there can be a transitional government made up of the regime, the opposition, civil society, which would lead transitional period, would have constituent assembly, a new constitution, election. And a lot of Syrians believe this is a good framework. The problem is the lack of will on the part, especially of the Assad regime, who is backed strongly by the by Putin, and Iran. And they believe that, they can basically impose Assad on the rest of the country, which is not happening. That's why it's going to really take a long, long time. I think weakening Putin's influence in Syria is a good thing, which, because he's been a negative force, not only for Syria, but for his own country and Ukraine and the rest of the world. So, I don't know.
I just wanted to
Yeah, but the constitutional, draft the new constitution is part of this process. Assad introduced a constitution in 2012, in the middle of the beginning actually of the uprising, and he made some actually good points. Like he eliminated that article about the Ba'ath being the leading parties. He allowed competitive presidential election, but he changed the term of the president so he can run again 2 more terms, which is, he already by then was in power for 12 years. And finally, he made like one article specifically would fit him really well. He said any candidate for president has to be continuously residing in Syria for the last 10 years. Now, Assad displaced half of the Syrian people, so everybody who opposed him was outside of it. So basically disqualified any potential opposition candidate from competing against him. And even though he allowed 2 individuals to run against him last year, and the 2 individuals combined, I think they got 1.7 point, and he got 97 something point of that so-called election. So, yeah, I mean, again, unless you really have more constructive, international solution, I think it's hard to say that Syrians can do it themselves.
Next question.
I'm interested in how the Syrian constitution is protecting political parties compared to the American constitution, which tries to avoid them at all costs and imposes supermajorities and federalism, separation of checks and balances, separation of powers. It seems like they're in my mind, I thought perhaps we should have some protections for political parties in the Constitution. But given the Syrian situation, maybe that's not a great idea.
Right. I mean, if you are protecting one party and only one party, I think this is a formula for one-party state. That's, I think, the example of all of the communist countries that allowed only, one communist party. Now, in some of the countries like Syria and other third world countries which followed the example of the so-called Eastern Bloc, they allowed smaller parties to function, but they don't give them the same right as the leading party or the ruling party. Like in this case of Syria, the Ba'ath party. Same thing was the situation in Iraq. So it's I mean, when you say the state, as is actually in this article, the political system is based on the principles of political pluralism. I think that was a major concession on the part of the Assad, which means there is a possibility to establish all kinds of political parties. Now, some political elite, what they try to do, they exclude their opponent constitutionally. So I mentioned the case of President Sisi of Egypt, who was the defense minister and carried out a military coup. The main opposition to Sisi was a group known as the Muslim Brotherhood, and they have a political party, and they won actually the previous election, fairly and squarely. They won the presidential election with 52%, was very competitive, was the only, really transparent election in the country. So what he did, he introduced a new article to the Constitution saying you're not allowed to form parties based on ethnicity, regions, or religion. And you guys are using religion as part of your background. So basically they were excluded from the political process. But these guys have, so much popular backing in the country. It's like, as you say in this country, maybe Catholics should not be allowed to form any political party or something. So again, it's really the spirit of what you're trying to do. You want to be inclusive and democratic. There are ways to do it. But if you want to find ways to exclude your opponent, again, there are so many ways.
Are there any more questions?